Okay, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really looking forward to talking to you. We're both a little bit frazzled. You just got off a plane and I just got done with tennis. So we are going to come alive, hopefully, during this episode. I'm really, really looking forward to talking to you. And I think that your perspective on a lot of health and wellness things are very refreshing. So I'd love to, first and foremost, just start with that. What is your wellness and your health philosophy, and how has it changed over time?
That's a great question. So I'm a naturopathic physician and I'm a chiropractor, and I had a wonderful mentor who brought me up for almost 2 decades. I was honored to be under his tutelage and his guidance, and he taught me the benefits of metabolic health, good metabolic health. And this was a long time ago before anybody else was talking about it. And he taught me about strength training, and the two go hand in hand. So I got an early deep dive education on metabolic health, muscle, all of that back in the 90s when everybody was doing, chronic cardio and running on the treadmill all day and eating vegan and really not prioritizing protein. And so it's been really interesting to watch social media as of late, because I feel like we're really evolving into this philosophy that I've held dear to my heart. But that's really the crux of it. And my background in medicine was in regenerative medicine. So I helped regenerate people's joints with natural solutions. And the core of that is good metabolic health. You can't heal if you're not in good health. So it doesn't matter if we use your stem cells or your blood to make PRP. If it's inflamed and it's not full of good nutrients, it doesn't do very much in the body. So that's kind of where it's all come together for me. And now I'm just online talking about it.
Let's define metabolic health, because I think a lot of people listening are probably not familiar with exactly what that means.
Sure. So your metabolism is your body's ability to assimilate nutrients and use them appropriately. So we eat carbohydrates, fats, proteins, and the idea is they go in, they get used the way they are supposed to get used, and our blood sugars remain somewhat constant. And it's a fine dance between insulin, blood sugars. There's a whole series of other signaling peptide hormones like leptin, ghrelin, GLp1, all of those go together. And unfortunately, 2018 data showed that about 94% of US adults are metabolically busted, which means their metabolism cannot weave and dodge, if you will. So if they eat a carbohydrate-rich meal, their body does not assimilate things well. Their blood sugar gets all whacked out. We should be able to be fat adapted when we need to. We should be able to be carbohydrate adapted when we need to. And we should be able to just shift between the two as needed. And unfortunately, I think most adults in the world at this point are having a lot of trouble with that. So that's what I mean by metabolic flexibility, metabolic resilience, is the ability to eat what you need or what's available, right? If you think of us, we're as primal beings, we ate what we came across, and we should be able to assimilate that and use that optimally. But unfortunately, most adults can't do that.
Yeah. Why can't most adults do that? Like, what are common hindrances to optimal metabolic health? Is it just kind of the standard Western diet, processed foods? Is it environmental toxins, stress, lifestyle, or all of the above? You're nodding your head.
Yes. It's all of it. So I think our planet is very much a toxic soup at this point. And that's not to scare anyone. We all have a bucket, and that bucket gets full based on how, the environment we were brought up in, what toxins were we exposed to. We're all exposed to massive amounts of ultra-processed, hyper-palatable foods that hijack our brains. They hijack our metabolism. People are not ingesting enough protein. I think that we've become too plant-centered and to the detriment of our metabolic health. People are not optimizing their muscle. I think physical fitness, when I was young, physical fitness was still really something admirable in schools, and that's gone now. Nobody really honors those who are physically fit, and therefore people aren't striving for that. Things have gotten ultra convenient. Kids are raised up, obviously. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. I know your audience knows all this, but sitting in front of a TV screen or a computer screen all day, not getting sunlight. I think light is a huge part of it, just lack of light, period. I know you live in LA, so you probably get more of it, but I'm in Oregon, and it's like dark for 9 months. So I think all of those culminate, and folks I call it the whatever diet. Some call it the standard American diet. I call it the whatever diet. I'll ask a patient, what do you eat? And they're like, oh, whatever. And that's just not, we have to be very conscious at this point on what we're putting in our mouth, because I think we're exposed to so much that really is just garbage. So it's all of it. Sleep, I think lack of sleep, blue light exposure, and then not getting ultimately good deep sleep is really screwing us up. So if there's a multitude of factors.
So I was born in the 80s, raised in the 90s. And when you were talking about kind of this pursuit of physical fitness, and that was something that was valued, I was thinking back to even when I was in elementary school, and like we would have PE class and we would do like the stretching thing. I don't know if you remember the box that you would put your legs in and see how far you could stretch. But there was an emphasis on taking care of your body in that sense. I mean, at the same time, there was also shitty cafeteria food. So it wasn't like perfect, but our lifestyle was so different. Like I played outside all day, every day. We didn't have screens at that time. Does that set somebody up for metabolic success later in their life compared to somebody who's raised eating whatever and processed foods and in front of a screen all the time? Like, is one better than the other, or can it kind of fall apart at any point?
I think it can fall apart at any point, but the way that your mother's metabolic health was determines how your metabolic health is going to be as offspring. So there's one factor that we never talk about or hear about. Unfortunately, it's the truth. And then secondarily, on top of that, your palate is sort of honed as a child because your microbiome gets set based on the food. So if you're eating a hyper palatable, ultra processed refined carbohydrate diet, these kids' microbiomes are being shifted towards craving that, wanting more of that. And then you're right, they're not active. So the muscle that we build as a child, I don't think we have enough data to equivocally say, but the glimmers of the data that I've looked at, your muscle mass as a child, the muscle memory, that matters into adulthood. And I think that's why we see some adults getting through things more unscathed than others, because going into, especially around, at least with neurologic development, like 7, 8, 9 years old, 10 years old, what happens with your metabolism there really seems to set the stage for what's going on down the line.
So when it comes to things like obesity, I know that a lot of people say, it's thermodynamics, it's energy in, energy out. And then there's the camp that says, no, it's way more complicated than that. So is this where somebody's metabolic health comes in, where for some people, their metabolic health is poor, so it is not as simple as eating less and working out more?
Yes. I think the calories in, calorie out, such a ingrained, into our society, an idea, and I think it's so false. It's part of it. It matters to a degree, but those who say that's everything, it's just thermodynamics, that's nonsense. There's hormones, there's insulin resistance. Your insulin resistance influences your hormones. Your insulin resistance, or insulin sensitivity, I should say, influences your muscle mass. Your muscle mass plays a role. Just simply activity level, just, non-exercise activity that people do. Some people just fidget. I'm a fidgeter. I fidget all day. I'm up and down. My husband's like, would you sit down? I'm like, no, I'm up. I'm walking the dogs. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. And I think all of that leads to improved metabolic health. I just read a story actually saying that if you spent 5 minutes on the stairs, it's equivalent to a 30-minute walk on a flat level.
Wow.
So those who take stairs, I just did a whole podcast about it. Like those who, there's all this data on stairs, right? So I love stairs, and I think that's part of my success. I've stayed relatively this size, and I'm 50, and I'm like, I fidget and I take stairs.
Like a stair stepper too, if you do that?
Yeah.
Okay, my boyfriend is going to be so happy because I'll talk to him and I'll say, I'm going to the gym, I'm going to work out. And then he calls me 20 minutes later and he's like, okay, I'm done. And I'm like, what did you do at the gym? And he's like, he swears by doing the stairs. Like he'll do a different workout in the day, but I'm always like, what are you doing for 20 minutes on the stairs? So he'll be very happy to hear that.
Yes. So I think it's all of the things, and they all add up. So it's not any one thing. We can't just say, well, it's calories in, calories out, or it's just hormones. There's a whole camp of people who come at me online and say, well, my hormones are messed up, so my functional medicine doctor said I can't lose weight. I'm like, that's also bullshit. It's that too, right? It's and this and this. So I think it's all of these different factors that we have to take into consideration. And it's what I call all the things we have to address. It's sleep, lack of, disrupted sleep. That's a huge factor. So taking that all into consideration will ultimately dictate someone's metabolic health.
So you have been very vocal online about your position around GLP-1, systemic glutides, Wegovy, everyone, different brand names, right? Wegovy, Ozempic,
Mounjaro. Yeah, those are the big ones.
And you changed your position around this, right?
Well, I never actually was against them.
Okay.
I just wasn't sure. So when I was asked about it early on, I was like, we'll see. Because I just kind of wanted to see how it would play out. And I didn't feel like I knew enough and I didn't have enough authority over the research to speak on it. So I stayed quiet and then I started researching it and it was not lining up with what we were hearing in the mainstream media. It was not lining up with what the health influencers were saying. It was not lining up. What I was finding was regenerative impact, anti-inflammatory impact, positive impact on immune system function, autoimmune disease, neurogenesis, which is regrowth of neurons in the brain. We don't have anything that does that. And I'm finding study after study after study. And some of these are on older generation GLP-1s on the market, like exenatide and liraglutide. And none of it was adding up with the fear-mongering. And the fear-mongering really seemed to kick in, interestingly, when the weight loss conversation came up. Yeah. That's when people really started kind of going sideways on it. And so I went in the rabbit hole. I was like, first of all, when everybody starts saying the same thing, it sounds like propaganda to me. So I always raise an eyebrow and I'm like, what's going on here? And then once I got about waist deep into the data, I was like, there's a lot of nonsense. The stats around some of these horrific side effects that we're seeing, first of all, I think those are management and dosing issues, which we can talk about. But secondly, the stats are not matching up with what the clickbait and the news articles and the big headlines are telling us. These are much more rare occurrences. And I mean, it's a big, long story, right? Because doctors are dosing their patients high, potentially sort of abandoning them with these high dosages. And that's all hell breaks loose. So I get why the camp over there is saying these are terrible. And people are seeing, a lot of health professionals are seeing terrible outcomes. I just talked to a nurse today and she's like, I just keep seeing ER visits of people having
paralysis and
they just kind of overdose on it. And, these are slow and low. They're signaling peptide hormones. They play in an orchestra with leptin and ghrelin and other appetite hormones, but they also have receptors throughout your entire body. They are generated in the gut and the brain. So they're doing something in the brain that's pretty critical. They seem to work on dopaminergic pathways, HPA axis, like pretty fascinating stuff that's way outside the realm of the gut and just appetite suppression and slowing down gut motility, which is what everyone thinks they do.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people don't even realize that it's a naturally occurring hormone in your body. And they think of it as like just a pure pharmaceutical, synthetic thing. So what is its role exactly in the body? You just mentioned that it's kind of this dance between other peptide hormones, leptin and ghrelin. What are some of the things that it does? And you can get into detail here. We love getting into the nitty gritty and how it helps with things like inflammation even, and some other more surprising things that people are not told about when they hear all of the fear mongering.
So it is generated in the L cells of the gut, and that is where it was predominantly understood to work, was in the gut. So slowing down gastric motility, which would impart a sense of feeling more full for longer. And then in the brain, acting on appetite suppression centers in the brain. And that's kind of where the story ended. And even in the biohacking community, in the sort of like bro science community where guys are using a lot of peptides, I went into everything. I bought every course. I went into everything. And all anyone was talking about it for was for weight loss or appetite suppression, maybe during a cut phase if you're a bodybuilder. So being used in a lot of different ways. And so I started asking all my colleagues, I was like, are you guys microdosing this at all? Meaning like super low doses. Are you using it for autoimmune conditions? Are you using it for anything else? It was being studied at the time for cardiovascular. That study just got published at the end of 2023. Really spectacular results. Data from that came out. They actually, I just saw on another doctor's Instagram, he was talking about there was a presentation done that, so this is not published data yet, but a presentation done showing that the impacts on the cardiovascular system were outside of weight loss. So irregardless of weight loss, there was still profound cardiovascular benefits, because that's the argument everyone has. Well, if you lose weight, of course, all these things are going to get better. Of course, your brain's going to improve. Of course, your heart's going to improve. But these are independent of weight loss. This has nothing to do with weight loss. There's data around Alzheimer's and Parkinson's because it's neuroregenerative. It's quells neuroinflammation. So it has an anti-inflammatory impact. It also sits on our immune cells and has a direct impact on our immune system. And they don't entirely understand how or why, but it sits on your mast cells. So we've got these conditions, mast cell activation syndrome and some of these conditions that, and I'm not saying it has directly been shown to treat these, but it's exciting to think about the potential. It has impacts on your bones and on your muscle. It does not deteriorate muscle like everyone thinks it does. It actually helps regenerate muscle tissue. It induces muscle protein synthesis. It helps with vascular supply to the muscle so that they get the amino acids they need. All kinds of exciting benefits on bone, on joints. Kidney regeneration. They had to stop the trial on kidney failure because it was unethical to deprive the control group because the results were so profound.
Wow.
I found a study showing in type 1 diabetics, if used early, that they could reverse type 1 diabetes because of the pancreatic regeneration impacts. It's doing all kinds of amazing things throughout the body that we don't entirely understand. And I'm hoping they will start to study it further. Alcohol cessation.
Yeah.
It makes people not want to drink. It makes people not want to smoke. It makes people not want to do different drugs. And so the studies are happening to some degree in some of these areas. Some of the data is definitely on mice and rats. Some of it's on humans. But if we understand the mechanism of action relatively, and we understand safety, meaning use it slow and low, then what are the impacts? That's what I've been trying to get out. Is like, what are the potential impacts here? What other pharmaceutical drugs might we be able to do away with? Drugs that people are on for life and nobody bats an eye. People go on blood pressure meds and they're like, oh, I guess I'm just resigned to taking blood pressure meds for life. Or they're on statin drugs or, and they start to collect drugs through. Most people my age are on 5 different pharmaceuticals.
Wow.
It's crazy. I'm on a couple hormones and they're pharmaceutical. I'm fine with that. But these usually are lifestyle. I'm not laying blame, but a lot of these are lifestyle conditions and people get put on drugs for life and they're like, I guess that's my fate. And I'm wondering if we've got something that's regenerative, anti-inflammatory and healing, what might the potential be there?
Yeah, I think it did get such a bad rap, though. I think that for whatever reason, I don't know, first it was the shortage and people were getting upset that people other than diabetics were using it.
Right.
And then, it was all the news about Ozempic face and the GI paralysis and pancreatic cancer, right? Was that one of the things?
Which has been dispelled. There's no pancreatic cancer. There's no thyroid cancer.
Like it had bad PR.
Yes, it got, and I wonder why.
Yeah.
There's some speculation as to why that might be.
What is some of the speculation? Because I feel like in general, like pharmaceuticals have pretty good PR because they're trying to push them on people.
I'm just speculating here, but there are some pharmaceutical companies who don't have GLP-1 agonists in their repertoire. So maybe they're not too excited because of what I just said, the potential for this potentially eliminating the need for some of these drugs that they might be selling. So there's one. Snack food companies are concerned. Big Food's concerned. Dialysis companies are concerned because type 2 diabetes is very profitable. And this is controversial, but the data shows there is this concept of metabolic healthy obesity. And the studies have been back and forth. But the data really shows, given enough time, those who are obese, who are metabolically healthy, will eventually decline into poor metabolic health. It's just a matter of time before that insulin resistance takes its toll, because fat cells ultimately are very pro-inflammatory. And so my argument is always, why don't we hit people with what they need early? Meaning, I had so many patients come in who were middle-aged women, and they would show up and say, I don't know what happened. I literally gained 15, 20 pounds out of nowhere. I haven't changed anything. And their pain would go up, their hormones would go sideways. Something happened, like a switch got blown, right? And my argument is that we intervene early, because down the line, given the opportunity to gain another 10 pounds and then another 10 pounds, these folks are looking at type 2 diabetes down the line. And type 2 diabetes is the extreme version of metabolic dysfunction. We blow it off and we've normalized it and made it like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's a very big deal. And it means your mitochondria and your metabolic health are severely dysfunctional by that point. My argument is, why are we not treating early? We don't wait till someone has a heart attack before we give them a blood pressure medication. So the long-term sequelae of type 2 diabetes is ultimately kidney failure, cardiovascular failure, brain failure. Alzheimer's is type 3 diabetes, basically. We've known this since the early 2000s. So I think that the companies who profit downstream might be very uncomfortable. That includes joint replacement companies.
Wow.
The snack food CEOs have come out and said, we're watching this. We're very concerned. Snack food sales are down. What about fast food companies? I mean, there's just a lot of different people who profit off of sick Americans.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. It's crazy. You mentioned mitochondrial health, and I was thinking about another guest that I had on recently. I don't know if you know Dr. Casey Means.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love her.
And she was talking about how, disease starts decades often before. And she was talking about her own hypothesis and how it kind of came to be after her mom was diagnosed with, I think, stage 3 or 4. Do you remember? Cancer.
Yeah.
And died like 13 days later or something like that. And so she started looking at it and she realized, oh, well, she had really bad menopause symptoms. And then after that, she had this. And then after that, and all of the doctors just said, oh, she was just, unlucky. And she was like, no, she had all of these things stacking up decades before she ultimately got sick, whether that was what caused the cancer or not,
Right.
she couldn't say. But it sounds like, we have such a reactive approach to health and medicine here. And it sounds like this can really potentially prevent so many of those issues from ever really coming to fruition.
That's what I'm thinking. That's why I got really excited about it, because I thought, well, first of all, my background's in regenerative medicine. So I put people's joints back together with stem cells and PRP and all of it long before it was cool. Like that's what I was doing in my clinic, just cranking out, patients and getting the healthy, fit people, keeping them going. I help healthy people stay and active people stay active. And the regenerative impacts of these is what got me excited, first off, because we really just don't have a lot of things that'll do that, especially for how inexpensive it is when you get it compounded. The compounded version is where you can really play with a dose. And so the standard version, I think for most people, is quite high. And they start at too high a dose. They get ramped up very quickly. It's a 16-week ramp up. I don't think that that's the way this needs to go. If insulin's a peptide. If we were to crank somebody out on insulin, we'd kill them. And yet we don't blame we should be talking to the doctor and the management. The dosing and the management is the key here. But for some reason with this peptide, these GLp1 agonists, the peptide's being blamed. And it's, in my opinion, a dosing and management issue. And so I think that the exciting part is that we could potentially have an impact on all these different systems, which I think is happening. And I think people are starting to figure it out. I don't think this is going anywhere. I do believe that people are being dosed too high, too fast, and then potentially just not managed well, like sort of let go. I don't know if a lot of doctors really know how to manage a patient that's metabolically busted or who has mitochondrial dysfunction. Like that's not in their traditional training, and I'm not dissing any of them, but I've gone to many conferences on metabolic health, and most of the doctors in there are metabolic train wrecks themselves. So I'm like, you guys clearly don't know how to manage this stuff. We need to be talking. Casey Means and Callie Means and I have all been having the same conversation. Like we have to get metabolic health in order first and foremost. And that's not something that traditional medicine has the bandwidth for. They don't have the understanding, and they don't really have the time in those visits to have those conversations with patients. Those are hard conversations. People don't want to hear that they're pre-diabetic. And then that's been so normalized. That's decades in the making. Pre-diabetes is like a 15, 20-year process before you hit the magic number of diabetes. But the disaster has been happening that entire time. And that's not often screened for. Even in my profession, in the naturopathic profession, I was often made fun of for screening for that early. People are like, why are you running serum insulins on everyone? I'm like, because everybody, and this is 17 years ago. And I was finding that everybody was metabolically busted back then. And I was getting a lot of shit from my colleagues. And now fast forward and we have the data. Like most US adults really are dealing with some kind of metabolic dysfunction and they're unaware of it. It's not being checked for. It's not being looked for. And next thing you know, they're, oh, well, you're diabetic and you have fatty liver. But that's normal.
Yeah.
It's okay. And then the American Diabetes Association tells you to eat more carbs.
Yeah.
It's just bonkers. The whole thing's backwards. So if we can intervene and we can help when that insulin resistance starts, I think we could really avoid a massive amount of healthcare costs down the line and misery for people.
Well, when you put it like that, it totally makes sense why there would be this push kind of against medications like this. Because to your point, so many people are incentivized to have people fat, sick, unhealthy, reliant on medications for the rest of their lives, in the hospitals, all of that.
It's a profit center.
Yeah, it's really sad. So it sounds a little bit like a panacea. Is there anybody who should not be considering these medications?
That's a good question. So this is the conversation that no one's having. The pancreatitis, the gallbladder, the gallstones, the thyroid cancer potential, all of those things are more likely in obese and diabetic folks. So we're taking a group of people, the only people that really have been we have studies on non-diabetic obese folks, but the majority of these studies are on diabetes, folks with type 2 diabetes. Those folks have such a propensity towards a lot of gastroparesis. The hyper sugaring of the vagus nerve eventually starts to disintegrate the vagus nerve, and that lands you in mild gastroparesis. So these folks might be experiencing dyspepsia, so they're burping, maybe their stomach feels slowed, but the doctor's like, here, take some Pepcid. This is not, you're fine. No, that's low-grade gastroparesis happening over a series of years. And so they get slammed with these peptides. And when you have somebody lose weight abruptly, the risk for pancreatitis goes up. When you have somebody lose weight abruptly and they go on a very low caloric diet, the risk for your gallbladder getting sludgy and thickened and throwing a stone into the pancreas is very common. The risk of gastroparesis is already my point being is some of these folks are kind of sitting on the edge already, and then they're being dosed too high, too fast, and they're getting thrown over the edge into these horrific side effects. I mean, pancreatitis is no joke, but the number one cause of pancreatitis is fatty pancreas, just like fatty liver, which is due to long-term insulin resistance. And the other is, and more prominent, is throwing a gallstone. So this needs to be managed a bit differently. Slow and low is always my motto. But those folks need to be more careful. And yet that's the group that it's approved for and it's being promoted for. So you see the conundrum.
Yeah.
I think that we just need more education around how to manage someone who's in a position of severe metabolic dysfunction, and we need to treat them gingerly and be careful and slow and low with things. And I think we'd get better outcomes if more doctors just really slowed the pacing of the dosing down.
How about the role in something like PCOS?
Yeah. Well, we have Ozempic babies and Mounjaro babies. I don't know if you've been hearing about that.
No, I heard the term, but I haven't heard what it is exactly.
It is significantly improving fertility, because it's reversing metabolic dysfunction. You touched on this earlier. These aren't drugs. These are peptides. Peptides are strings of amino acids. Strings of peptides make proteins. Peptides insert themselves where they need to go to heal things and to fix things up. That's how all the peptides work. We have like BPC 157. We've got a whole slew of them. The FDA
That's for gut, right?
It's for gut. It's for regeneration. Okay. We've got a couple that are still available to us as doctors, but a bunch of them got pulled in November of 2023 by the FDA. Just abruptly, suddenly there was a secret meeting and all the peptides were off the market, which is unfortunate. But so these are peptides. Semaglutide, for instance, is bioidentical to the GLP-1 that we make in our body. And it's just tweaked a little bit because GLP-1 naturally occurring has a very short half-life. So it's in and out of your system and it only works for a short amount of time. That's why we can't really test for it. But semaglutide has a longer half-life, which is about a week. So that's really the only difference, is they just tweaked one of the amino acid strings to essentially make it last longer in the body. So if we have these peptides in there working their magic, they ultimately over time and duration heal. So it's not just when you're on the peptide that the magic's happening. It's healing your tissues. It's healing the metabolism. And in healing the metabolism, we heal conditions like PCOS and infertility, which is a huge issue. Like, humans are legitimately going extinct all over the world. It's not subtle and nobody wants to talk about it. And every once in a while you'll hear a quip from Elon Musk and he'll say, here's the stats in this country. And I'm like, this has been going on a long time. When I was in practice, early on, the amount of infertility I was seeing in women very young was shocking to me, and it's gotten significantly worse. And it's all due to metabolic dysfunction and to insulin resistance. And so when you correct for that, you correct for the infertility, And now we have these Mounjaro and Ozempic babies.
Mm-hmm.
The other part to that, though, is that because it slows gastric motility, it'll slow down how long the birth control pill is in your body going through you. So it can impact how the birth control pill is going to work. So there is obviously some concern there too. But I've always told patients, as your health improves, as your metabolism improves, be careful because you've been using your poor health as your birth control.
Mm-hmm.
And we get their thyroid fixed up, we get their metabolic health fixed up, and next thing you know, they're pregnant, whether they wanted to be or not. So that's one of the things I think people need to be careful of.
What do you say to people who make the argument that we don't know what these medications do long term? Because you hear a lot of people push back and say, well, good luck in 20 years. Come back and talk to us then.
Yeah.
And, you mentioned that these have been around for a long time, right? There are some other brands that we're not as familiar with that have been on the market for longer. So what do you say to that?
It's a good question, and it's a fair question because the semaglutide and tirzepatide are relatively new. Semaglutide is Wegovy and Ozempic, and tirzepatide is the Mounjaro. Those are relatively new in the last few years. However, this class of GLp-1 agonists has been on the market and being used for 20 years. So we had exenatide coming out and being used in the early 2000s. That wasn't as nice of a drug. You had to use it every day. The dosing and the compliance issue were the real problem. So patients didn't love it, doctors didn't love it, and I'm sure some of the side effects were not as it's gotten cleaner, I should say. They've cleaned it up. So I don't think these are new. And then we've had other generations of this that had been in use, millions of prescriptions, and nobody said boo until suddenly we had this situation with weight loss, and now it's just all clickbait headlines. So I'm not concerned, but the other thing we need to discuss is risk tolerance. Nobody ever has that conversation. What is best for me is not always best for you. And when you've got a patient sitting in front of you and they are 30, 40 pounds overweight, maybe they're 60, 80 pounds overweight, maybe they're more. I mean, I've had patients that weighed 400 pounds, and these are intelligent, sharp individuals. There are various reasons, which we don't need to get into because it gets complicated, but there are many reasons for obesity. Some of it is genetic. There are genetic components to leptin signaling or leptin reception. It's nuanced. So there's pieces to, and I'm not an obesity expert, but I have studied it enough to realize, wow, a lot of data has come out since the 70s all the way up into the 90s when leptin was discovered up until now. And a lot of that data has been squelched. The authorities that be are like, nobody's going to buy that. That can't be. So let's just not publish that paper. There's a whole book about it. And what I found is that a patient might be willing to risk a little bit of nausea or diarrhea in order to not have the headlong journey into type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, blindness, stroke, kidney failure. Or maybe they're already in the throes of that. And they're like, a little bit of nausea, sign me up. Like, please, I would love to get out of this hole. And I don't know if you know anyone who is severely obese and or diabetic, but there is a loss of hope that starts to happen. The longer they stay there. My dad has been in the throes of this for decades. I've watched every single person in my family become obese and diabetic. My aunt just died from it. And I wish that I had this tool earlier. I would have had so many more patients on it, honestly, and not at high doses, at tiny, whatever dose they need, right? The dosing is in the individual sitting in front of me. That's what determines it. But sometimes people need a leg up. And so we have to weigh the risks versus the benefits for that individual. And I think that's the conversation no one's having. Everybody's so worried about their neighbor and they're so worried about their work colleague. And I'm like, why don't you worry about yourself? It's very reminiscent of 2021 when everybody was so worried about what everyone else was doing with their health. And I'm like, how about we just leave this up to the person who's going through it, because that's their business. And maybe they don't mind running the risk of having some of these side effects. Maybe they do, but that's what an informed consent, a good informed consent with your physician is all about, which also seemed to go by the wayside in 2021. But we, like your doctor should be sitting down and telling you everything. And then they should be keeping tabs on you. You don't just dose high and send your patient off, right? If that's what's happening for people, they need to find a different doctor. But again, we don't need to blame the peptide for something that is human error. There's going to be people who abuse it. They're going to abuse it for weight loss. They're going to waste away down to nothing because their brains are more prone to that anorexia side of things. I used to be anorexic. I get it. Being super skinny gets very addictive. I understand. But again, doctors and patients have been abusing pharmaceuticals for ever. You know, it's just, I mean, we see people who are on too many steroids. We see all of it. So I think it comes down to risk tolerance and just having good informed consent, understanding what they're getting into. And then the patient needs to advocate for themselves. This is something that is never discussed. You have full control over what happens to you as a patient.
Yeah.
You need to speak up. You need to educate yourself and you need to speak up. And that way you can have informed conversations with your physician and say like, hey, I'm doing really well at this dose. Let me stay here. And a good doctor will be like, that's cool. No doctor really wants to crank you up on the highest dose of anything, right? So I think we're just missing a lot of the nuance in the conversation, which I'm really grateful that we're having it here because that's what good medicine's all about.
Yeah. Well, you brought up so many amazing points that I think people just haven't thought about because we're just inundated with one message, which is, or maybe multiple messages, but of the same position, which is that this is only for people with diabetes, people who are overweight. It's nobody else needs it. We don't know the long-term implications. It causes all of these, unwanted side effects. And that's that. And to your point, there is so much nuance. And I heard you say somewhere that the majority of your patients that are on it are not overweight.
No.
Right?
Yeah. We're not using it for weight loss.
Yeah.
I will say that all of them had just kind of a nice little bonus of losing a few pounds, but everybody dropped into their fighting weight.
Yeah.
Everybody just dropped into the weight where they were strongest and felt good. And it hasn't budged. Doesn't matter what I do with a dose. It doesn't budge down. They just are kind of at this good, happy place. And I'm using it for autoimmune conditions. I'm using it for inflammatory bowel disease. I'm using it for arthritis. I'm using it for cardiovascular, high blood pressure, alcohol cessation. The only person I've got on it for weight loss is my dad, and he's the only one I'm dosing up on because he's 80 something and he's got one foot in the grave.
Right.
And we've got to pull him out. And he's willing to, he's willing to try. And then I told him, if you're getting good benefit from this, great. But if you don't start exercising and going for walks, I mean, the man literally has been immobile for a long time, then I'm taking it away. Like there has to be that conversation too. The doctor actually has to set some parameters around the patient and prioritizing muscle, prioritizing your protein macros, making sure that we have to fight for our muscle as we get older. I don't know how old you are, but at a certain point, it's an uphill battle.
Yeah.
Like it's not, it just like you're literally fighting just to maintain, right? And so I'm not going for like Hulk level, but I need to manage my muscle. And so I think come on, most doctors don't have any appreciation for that, to be honest with you. Most doctors, even up until a few years ago, it was all cardio, cardio, cardio.
Yeah.
I was like the token doctor up on stages at conferences saying, we got to strength train, guys. And they would just sort of heckle me and poo-poo me and blow me off. And I was like, okay, it was all about cardio. So I think that there's just a conversation as a whole around medicine needs a shift. I think it's happening though. I think,
really?
Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, I think, has done such great work. Yeah. Dr. Casey Means. I mean, if enough of us keep saying the same thing over and over, it's sticking. And I have the cutest elderly followers. I've got like ladies who message me in their 70s and 80s and they're like, I just started lifting weights.
Wow.
Because of you. And I was like,
that's
good.
Amazing.
Now don't break a hip. Like we're doing this so we don't break a hip. Like that's why we strength train, right? So we can live good, independent lives and we don't end up in old folks' homes with somebody else taking care of us and not remembering our name and breaking a hip. So.
And it keeps you looking amazing, keeps your skin good, right?
Yes.
That's a whole different conversation.
Yes, the fountain of youth.
Yeah. So
Truly.
Maybe that's part 2.
Yes. Yeah. Vanity is a big player. And that's, if I can, it's usually pain and vanity that I motivate patients on. So whichever one
that's
I got to tap into.
Me.
Yep. Whichever one I got to tap, and sometimes both, like whatever I got to tap into.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, so fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of that. Tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah, thank you. It's so fun. I'm glad to talk about this with someone who is friendly about it. So I'm on Instagram at Dr. Tyna. It's DrTyna. And that's my website as well, drtyna.com. And I have a free 4-part video training that I go into. Part 1, I talk about all the benefits outside of weight loss. So beyond weight loss. Part 2, I talk about, the big scaries. I go into more depth around some of these these side effects that we've talked about. And then in part 3, I talk about how the dose makes the poison. And then part 4, I talk about really how to protect your muscle. So hopefully people can grab that. It's free. It's on my website.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.